Alrighty. Oh, where's the wireless mic? Always something. Okay, so let's get my sound going here. But as you probably, whoa, too much noise. As you probably noticed, as of about 10 last night, I guess it was probably about 10:40 by the time I finished marking. Grades for the second midterm are posted. Once again, I'm really sorry that it took so long. It was not at all my intention for that to be the case, but it's done now. So if you want to review, we obviously have, the 2 days left this week after today. I'm completely swamped today. I got no time because I have 2 other classes today and one is a 3-hour seminar. But tomorrow, in terms of review, I'm available most of the day via Zoom or Google Meets. I guess I use Google Meets more than Zoom. And Friday, kind of 11 to 1, and maybe after 2. But given that the traffic gets so bad on Friday afternoons, I really want to get out of here after my afternoon class. So, between, let's say, 2 and 3, because I'd like to leave as quickly as possible so as not to spend half my life in traffic. But send me an email. We will book a time. And then next week, I'm pretty much wide open in terms of ability to meet. So just shoot me off an email and let me know what works. Okay, so last time. The class average, by the way, was 81%, which I consider pretty good. Much improved from the first midterm. So, I'm pretty happy with that overall. All right. So last time we talked about the religious landscape and we got done with the religious landscape. And I almost brought in more religious landscape stuff this morning that's new because yesterday Ryan Burge published another article on sort of what's going on with men and women, and it's super interesting. But I figured maybe if we have time at the end of the course, I will bring that in. But we're going to move on to the nuns. So our next kind of grounded topic, which is looking at the nuns, or this category, right? And I kind of have this neat little, survey box, people who check off nun in terms of their religious identity. We're talking about who they are, what it looks like, and get a little bit of kind of Canadian and American data and try and figure out, what's inside this box of the nuns, because what's inside is kind of weird and fascinating. Okay. So a lot of this, oops, my doodles from last year are still here. A lot of this is going to come from both Ryan Burge and his Substack, and he also has a book called The Nuns, but also from this book, The Nun, or None of the Above, Non-Religious Identity in the U.S. and Canada. And these are 2 great Canadian scholars of religion, Joel Thiessen, who's an acquaintance at Ambrose University in Calgary, which is kind of like Calgary's equivalent of King's University, a small evangelical school, but he does really, really cool and really interesting work. And Sarah Wilkins Laflamme at University of Waterloo. And they work a lot together. And, because sometimes people want to know, Joel is an evangelical, and Sarah is an atheist. So they work together really well. And her interest is non-religion in the future in Canada. Okay, so who are the nuns? What is within this category according to Thiessen and Laflamme? Okay, so the majority of our nuns in the U.S. and Canada, they say, are what they call non-verts, right? People who were socialized in religion to some extent, and have deconverted or changed their identification. Now again, this doesn't mean that these are all, people who would have considered themselves intensely religious, right? Like I said, one of the things that we probably see, and certainly if we look at, say, Christian Smith's data on Catholics in the US, a lot of this is what's called, and I talked about this last time, marginal peel-off. right? Where basically people who are marginally religious are being peeled off into non-religion, right? Into changing their identification. Okay, so really starting with Gen X and moving forward through the generational cohorts. So Gen X, Millennials, Gen Z, and we don't have a ton of data, but I'm sure we'll see it in Gen Alpha or the Polars or whatever you want to call them as well. We're seeing an increasing kind of group of what you would call cradle nuns, right? Or those raised with no or anti-religious socialization, right? So no religious socialization. This is not something that they ever encountered, or their parents actively were opposed to religion and socialized them in that way as well. Okay, and what Sarah and Joel say is that as organized religion plays a smaller and smaller role in kind of life, disaffiliation or leaving religion has become a more viable cultural option. So kind of like what I was saying last time, right? Where if you went back, say, to the 1980s, even people who were highly marginal in their religious identities either attended, a few times a year or never attended, probably still would have said that they were, Lutheran, or I don't need to write that, Lutheran or Methodist or United Church or Catholic or something, right? Because everybody was sort of expected to have a religious identity, whether you were practicing or not. As we've moved through like the 90s and the 2000s, that social pressure has declined, and it means that just identifying as non-religious has become a more viable cultural option. So again, this I think plays a little bit to that argument that Glenn Stanton was making, that I touched on briefly in his book, The Myth of the Dying Church, that essentially what you're seeing is a sort of clarification, right? All of these folks who are marginal, or a large number of folks who are marginal, are just ceasing to identify marginally with religion, and they're now, they're now identifying as nothing in particular because that has become a viable option culturally, right? There's no cultural pressure to do otherwise. Okay, and this, kind of like a snowball rolling down a hill as it becomes a more viable cultural option, as more of the people around you identify that way, right? It's going to have a kind of snowball effect. It's going to grow over time. And as we talked about, in the religious landscape slides, right, we've seen the nuns basically go from like 4% in Canada in the 1970s, right, in I think 1972 wave of the census, or 1971? 1971 would have been the wave of the census, till our 2021 wave, about 34%. Now, the snowball will only go downhill for so long till it reaches the bottom, and you've basically peeled off all the people that are going to be peeled off, potentially. And we did talk about, last time that in the US, it looks like we've probably hit a sort of plateau for the nuns in terms of, composition of generational cohorts. So, there is all of that. Okay. So, where do the nuns come from? And like Ryan Burge, Joel and Sarah, or Thiessen and Laflamme, have similar conclusions, right? Most of the nuns in the US and Canada are from our more liberal mainline Protestant denominations, right? Now, those denominations are slightly different in each country, right? There's no real Methodist church in Canada, but there's also no United Church in the United States. So different sources, right? But those big formerly big mainline Protestant churches are where the bulk of the growth has come from. So, Stark is right, I think, in saying it's the collapse of the mainline that's really driving a kind of religious crisis. And Ryan Burge and Thiessen and Laflamme agree with this. Now, you also have, and more so in Canada, I think, than in the US, significant contributions from Catholics and evangelical Protestants in terms of, people contributing to the nuns. And again, not every person raised Catholic is deeply involved in it or deeply loves it. Not every evangelical Protestant is, super involved in that religion either. And some of those marginal kind of believers have also been peeled off. So you have that, I don't have it because it was in the last slideshow, but you have that kind of slow decline for Catholicism and evangelicalism, which is driving some growth in the nuns, but a lot of that growth seems to become, or has just come from the mainline collapse. In Canada, Buddhists have also contributed a little bit. Those raised Buddhist, but they're a small percentage of the population. And other minority faiths, are Muslims, are Sikhs, are Hindus, do contribute some as well. There are some people, obviously, that peel off who are marginal from those religions as well. But until very recently, bless you, they were a very small share of the population. And so it hasn't been a meaningful contribution to it. Now, as they grow as a share of the population, we're likely to see bigger contributions there as well. Now, one thing, and this is something that they note, evangelicalism compared to mainline Protestantism has proven a bit more durable than in terms of religious kind of or generational replacement and people staying within that kind of faith community. It's proven more durable than mainline Protestantism, and arguably more durable than some forms of Catholicism as well. And this has meant, so in the US, we have a large percentage of people who identify as evangelicals, which Thiessen and Laflamme suggest has kind of blunted, at least for the moment, the growth of the nuns somewhat. So when we say that, and we look at it and we see that the nuns have grown faster and are a bigger share of the population in Canada than in the US, part of that seems to be related to the fact that evangelicals are almost absent from the landscape until relatively recently in Canada. The Protestant side in Canada was mostly dominated by mainline Protestants. And as they've collapsed, they've really contributed to that growth of the nuns in Canada. And there wasn't this kind of base of evangelicals that, mainline Protestants who still wanted to be religious could then jump into those churches, therefore kind of maintaining. And there wasn't a big kind of religious body like evangelicalism that had relatively good retention rates to slow the growth of the nuns as we see in the US. Okay. So, religious socialization, or irreligious socialization, as it were. So, this again from Wilkins and Laflamme. In 2008, 56% of U.S. religious nuns reported their parents had a religious affiliation. So, I mean, that's notable, right? So that means, again, 44% would be cradle nuns, roughly, right? Meaning their parents don't have a religious affiliation. So still a majority of those who are becoming nuns in the US are, grew up with parents who had some kind of religious affiliation, right? We don't know how much of that it is or how dedicated they were, but definitely their parents at least identified religiously in some way. And no surprise there, right? Because when we're talking, if we're talking about millennials, especially, their parents are mostly the baby boomers who still mostly have a religious identity. Okay, half said they attended religious services growing up, which again means that half didn't. So half of them never attended religious services or really infrequently. And you look at the Canadian numbers and they are relatively similar. Okay. So, if we see people who are let's just take a look at this chart really quickly. So both parents had a religious affiliation. 56% of the nuns say that's the case, and half, say they attended religious services at least once a month when 12 years old. So, they're going 12 times a year or slightly more. For those with religious affiliation, right, 88% of their parents had both parents had religious affiliation. 82% went, at least once a month when 12 years old. And the numbers don't look all that different in Canada, right? Both parents had a religious affiliation, 55% of the nuns, and 50% went at least once a month. These numbers are basically identical. This number is a little bit higher, but 6% higher. It's outside of, I would say, margin of error, but still relatively similar. Okay, so when does it happen? When do people tend to disaffiliate from religion? The trend is pretty clear, right? Late adolescence, so 15 years old or more, and young adulthood, right? So what we would call, I think they're both sociologists, what I would call emerging adulthood, so 19 to 29 would be kind of where most of the disaffiliation is happening. Now, again, one of those things that I think sometimes we get fooled by, maybe by YouTube or by, really the stories that tend to circulate, say, in the media, is that, something happened and all of a sudden, people's eyes were opened or whatever, and they lost their faith like in a flash, right? However, when you look at the survey data and the qualitative data, people will reflect that the process of disaffiliation tends to be rather gradual. And it often looks something like this, right? You turn 16, and your parents, who previously had been saying that you had to attend religious services with them, it's like, okay, well, now you're 16, you can make up your own mind. And at first you go sometimes, and then you go less, and then you move out to go to university or college in the US. And now there's no pressure from your parents, so you go less and less and less. And at some point, you just find that you haven't gone in a really long time, and it doesn't really bother you, and you don't really care. And you realize that, maybe I never believed this in the first place. And, I just don't really care. So it's generally not, a severe disaffiliation. And this is kind of what this next point sort of stresses. For most mainline Protestants or liberal Catholics, right, their experience is what Zuckerman calls mild disaffiliation, right? It just sort of fades away, right? They fade away from religion. There's no particular moment, like a break, where they are suddenly like, I don't believe any of this. It doesn't make any sense. It's just kind of like, and they're not against it necessarily, right? They're not against religion. They're just like, nah, I don't go. I don't really believe it. I don't really care. Nothing in particular, right? And it's more or less untroubled, right? It's not like this big, traumatic religious event. Again, you probably don't pay as close attention to this space as I do, because probably almost no one pays as close attention to this space as I do. But you hear a lot, and in the kind of podcast worlds, there's a lot of like what are sometimes terms ex-evangelicals, right? Like evangelicals, but ex-evangelicals. And a lot of those stories are like some kind of real religious crisis hit. And yeah, I'll get to your question in 2 seconds. Some real religious crisis hit, and people severely disaffiliated and just left the faith. For most people, right, especially from these backgrounds, that doesn't seem to be what happened. They disaffiliate, they disaffiliated, but they weren't overly religious to begin with. Yeah, please.
What's the difference between the mild disaffiliation with the more liberal backgrounds and the more traumatic disaffiliation with the more, conservative backgrounds? Would that be due to the more dissimilarity of the conservative values?
So it probably has to do with a couple of things. Yeah, you're probably a lot closer in terms of general social values, right, on all sorts of issues in kind of the liberal mainline and liberal Catholic churches, like, LGBTQ rights, same-sex marriage, probably medical assistance in dying, a lot of those things you'd kind of be in line with already. So there's a big change in your belief structure. There's also probably a lot less family pressure, right? Like if you are, coming from a much more religious background where it matters a lot more to your family, disaffiliating is going to be a pretty staunch break, right? If you're sort of your parents are, shall we say, marginal themselves, they're not going to care as much if you sort of just stop going, right? It's going to represent a much less traumatic or much less contentious kind of move. Does that answer your question? Okay, perfect, good. Yeah, you're reading ahead on my slides. Formerly evangelical and conservative Catholic nuns underwent a more transformative and more traumatic disaffiliation, right? They're having to switch further because they're going from, typically, even if you want to just talk politics, a very kind of conservative kind of politics and theology to typically a pretty liberal one, right? You see this, and I'll say the other group because I know a few people who've undergone this. Mormons who deconvert often go through this very traumatic deconversion. I had a friend, more of an acquaintance actually than a friend. I didn't really like him, but we ran in the same circles, who had disaffiliated from Mormonism because he was gay, and his family was very, very Mormon, and I believe his mother said, "I wish you had just died rather than coming out," right? And that is a very traumatic, obviously, kind of departure. And then, obviously, coming out as a gay man, he swung very much, from a fairly conservative to a very kind of socially liberal kind of worldview and understanding. So that's pretty traumatic in general. Okay. So what are our variables? So how does this happen? And what do we find as common themes in a lot of the accounts of people who disaffiliate? Okay, so a couple of similar trends. Parents give religious choice to children, right? So the more you give children a religious choice, the more likely disaffiliation is. Intellectual disagreements, this often, will, man, I picked a good picture. I really like this picture. I don't know why. So science will often feature in this. Sometimes evolution is kind of prominent, right? Intellectual disagreements, and then increasingly, like on a social level, LGBTQ plus rights, and abortion. I guess sexuality in general, especially as the kind of cultural environment shifts away from more traditional sexualities, right? More things that would have been in line with, say, traditional religious thinking to, everybody lives with their partner and is sexually active with their partner before they get married. All of that, it can lead to some disagreements. It can be on a wide range. And there was one other one, increasingly, I think we see it in Canada. I don't know how well you can see my writing. You can't see it well. The picture is too good. Medical assistance in dying or euthanasia, right? Okay, social influences, particularly of peers as we enter late adolescence. Romantic partners also play a significant role. Life transitions and irreligious socialization, obviously. All right, let's go through these in a little bit more detail. Okay, so choice. Yeah, for those who disaffiliate, parents generally gave their teens or preteens choice of continued religious involvement. And like I said, this often happens around 16 years old, right? As you're transitioning out of being, a teen, a kid, a teen, and transitioning more into, adulthood, and your parents treat you more as an equal, parents start to give young people more religious choice. And for those who give them more religious choice, and especially the earlier you give it, the more likely this is. More increasingly, teens and preteens will choose to end their religious involvement. So many take this moment to kind of step away, especially if they didn't feel a ton of religious salience to begin with. Okay, so generally this happens in families with low religious salience, infrequent prayer, infrequent interaction with holy text, right? So not a lot of reading of the Bible or the Quran or the Torah. The ones that I can't pronounce out of Hinduism and Sikhism. less frequent religious service attendance, or religion not being discussed at home very often. Okay, so this, what Thiessen and Laflamme say is here there is a fuzzy line. That's an arrow, but a very bad one. I'm sorry. I have to fix it. Sometimes the pen is great. Sometimes the pen is bad. There's often... No, I got a highlighter now. Everything's broken. Okay. There we go. Happy days. All right. Better arrow, kind of. A fuzzy line between disaffiliation and irreligious socialization. So this kind of scenario, right, where you have families who are not often discussing or praying or reading holy texts is close to irreligious socialization, right? It might be this, like, if we're talking about religious identity, this is going to be about as marginal as you can find, right? It's very, very marginal because it's just not that important, obviously, to the people within that family because they don't talk about it very often, right? They don't go, they don't talk about it. So anyway, it can be a fuzzy line, like what was irreligious socialization? What was very marginal religious socialization? It's not super clear. Okay. For those with weak religious affiliation, there's sufficient religious affiliation to allow teens to decide that they're done, right? So, they're at least religious enough for the people to reflect on whether they want to continue as part of that religious group or not. Okay, again, also a possible element of irreligious socialization, right? Maybe parents who are giving young people a choice are also, socializing them in irreligious kind of ways of thinking towards things like pluralism being good, everybody needing to make their own choice, all religions being equal, of equal value, these sorts of things, rather than particularistic or anchored in particular religious traditions. Okay. And yeah, some proportion of parents seem to think that religious socialization is unimportant or only a little important. And here, sorry, because I teach another class, which is the sociology of youth and religion, one thing I'll kind of throw in here, there's also a not insignificant cohort of parents who, and this group is getting smaller and smaller over time, who basically want to take their kids to religious services, when they're young, right? So let's say between like 2 and 10, with the idea that they want to give their children a sort of moral foundation based in some kind of religious teaching, but they're not that committed to it themselves. And what will tend to happen, right, when their kids disaffiliate, they themselves also disaffiliate, right? And they might keep, oh, I'm still a Methodist or I'm still United, but once their kids are no longer there, or they feel like they've given their kids that kind of basic moral education, it's like, okay, I've done enough, and I was never really that religious, and they themselves stop attending, right? They might still identify religiously, but their attendance numbers and their salience goes way down, right? We tend to see this kind of happen in the 40s and 50s, right, where people having, put their children on the right path, according to them, their own religiosity sort of takes a swan dive. Which is always weird because people expect the opposite. It's like as people get older and the grim hand of death approaches closer and closer, that people would become more religious. But actually, as people get older, you actually tend to see, in a lot of cases, the opposite. They become less religious for all sorts of reasons, but a lot of it has to do with their kids. Okay, I talk about this all day, but I shouldn't. So, intellectual disagreements. This is kind of like what I laid out on that first slide. Evidence based on science versus faith. And again, you can look at Smith's work on this. Christian Smith, sorry, I just assume you know who Smith is. Christian Smith's work on this. It's a pretty strong assumption with young people, that science is fact and religion is, faith, which they take as, opinion. I hear Joan muttering. I don't know why, but I'm just gonna go with it. She didn't raise her hand, so I'm not going to ask her a question. Okay, so this is very common in young people, right? They've locked themselves into this sort of dichotomous thinking that science is fact, religion is faith, and therefore which one of these gets the gold star as the better one, right? It's the fact side rather than the faith or opinion. And so when they perceive conflicts coming into this relationship, right, they're going to tend towards the science side because it's presented as just so solidly based, right? Okay, so then you obviously have personal experiences not aligning with religious or church teaching. Again, this is often around abortion, LGBTQ issues around human sexuality, all of those sorts of things. Religious pluralism. This is, a classical secularization argument, right? If you wanted to go back to Marx and Weber and Berger, and their, pluralism is right in Berger's kind of sacred canopy idea, right? That pluralism makes religious truth claims dubious, right? Because, okay, I'm friends with, Mohammed, who's Muslim. I'm friends with, I can't think of a stereotypical Indian name for some reason. Arman, who's Hindu, and we all have our different religious beliefs, and that in itself sort of makes any particularistic religious belief seem somewhat dubious, right? Because we all have our religious traditions, we all believe in them to some extent, and they all kind of contradict each other. And it's like, okay, well, obviously religion, especially unlike science, obviously is culturally specific, culturally contingent, and therefore less solidly grounded, or this is the thinking, right? And it makes religious claims more dubious. Okay, and this one, and I actually am wondering if this has somewhat reversed. People were talking about this after the 2016 election. You saw a sort of wave of disaffiliations, especially really prominent ones, especially in the evangelical community, and people sort of called this the Trump effect, right? That evangelicals and conservative Roman Catholics had gone so hard for Trump, and he's such a distasteful figure to some people, that it had kind of pushed people away from religion. Right? Like, if this is what Christians believe, then I want no part of Christianity. Now, again, we've seen a kind of swing towards Trump in a lot of groups that really didn't like him the first two times. And so I can't say for certain that this effect is now neutralized. But certainly, there's been a lot of people that have said, I don't like the linking of conservative politics to religion, right? In ways that often, especially young people who tend to be more socially progressive, tend to find quite distasteful. Okay. Mixed marriages. According to Thiessen and Laflamme, and I will say, Smith agrees with this. Regnerus, I forget how to spell his name as well. Oh, who else? Oh, Cressy Dean. I would say like the bulk of like sociologists that have worked on this all basically agree on this point. Mixed faith marriages, or faith and no faith marriages, right, are inefficient with regards to religious transmission. And I'll square up inefficient. The literature on this is not even particularly controversial. It's actually basically about as close as a sociological consensus as you can find. Mixed marriages, right? So people who have mixed marriages in terms of their religious identities, Protestant Catholic, Catholic Hindu, or whatever it happens to be, it doesn't work really well for religious transmission. Do I have this on another slide? Oh, I don't. Family forms other than So married parents and all the kids are biologically related, any other family form is far less efficient for religious transmission as well. So this is everything. Single parent families, divorced families, step families, blended families, complex, simple blended families, they're all less efficient in religious transmission.
But like parents are biologically related to the children to each other.
No, not to each other, to the children. Sorry. Definitely, I don't know about those ones. That's a small sample size, I hope. But yeah, no, both parents, all the kids that live in the household are related to both parents, right? So no stepkids, none of that, right? So like essentially to make the difference between a step family, right? Two-parent families where you have a step parent are not as efficient in religious transmission on the whole. So basically every other kind of marriage type or family structure other than the traditional nuclear family is less efficient at religious transmission. Now that doesn't mean it doesn't happen, right? But the factors that tend to influence it, two parents that share the same kind of commitments that are reinforcing each other in terms of their faith commitments all the time is far more effective. They have more resources, they have more time to dedicate to it, right? Is far more effective at religious transmission than any other form of kind of family structure. And again, it's just this reinforcing thing. If mom is, a very devout Roman Catholic and dad is an atheist, or vice versa, right? The children are going to tend towards the path of least resistance. And they will, when they don't want to participate in religious activities, which inevitably children will not at some point, they'll use the other parent against, they'll use the parents against each other in different ways. Okay. So, how am I doing for time? So good. I got through so many slides today. I'm so proud of myself. Usually really, 13. Not as well as I thought. Okay, we're gonna keep going. I can do more. I got 11 minutes. Okay, adolescence, really key time, right, in terms of religious identity formation. So it is a period of identity instability, right? You hit adolescence. The hormones invade your brain, rotting it from the inside. No, I have one teenager and one on the way. So this is my only conclusion. But right, and you start to go through this very natural process of separation from your parents, right? Where you try to figure out your own identity, what you believe. Your peers become more important in this period than parents in a lot of ways. And it's really key, it plays a really key role in religious identity to the point where, and I don't have statistics on this, but this is something that's widely claimed in religious circles, which often they claim things that are, not entirely true sociologically, but whatever. If basically they'll say that, if the person is still faithful at 18, the chances that they remain are considerably higher, right? But that you lose most people kind of between 15 and 18. And again, I think this is mostly anecdotal, but definitely this period of development plays a key role. Okay, youth raised in religious families are more likely to be religious than those raised in non-religious families. So this is obvious, right? Religion doesn't come from nowhere, right? Religion is part of the process of socialization. Very few people who are never exposed to religion will immediately become religious at some point, right? It's a learned behavior like anything else. And so it has to be introduced at a very, specific point while identity is still forming. It's only something like 5 to 8% of people who are, adults ever convert to a new religion. It's a very, very small number. Okay. And studies suggest that, I said this on the last slide because I like to ruin my slides, children who live with married biological parents are most likely to be religious, and marriage is a key value in many religious communities. So much so that children often invest their parents' marriages with a sort of sacred aura, right? That it is, their marriage is part of their religious values. So, how to put this? I don't think I have this on the slides. This is from a totally different course. But I have so much random knowledge about these things. Children whose parents are very religious and whose parents then get divorced experience what sometimes referred to as sacred loss, right? Where it's like, oh, they had invested so much kind of religious meaning into their parents' marriages that when their parents get divorced, it actually damages their religious faith, because it's like, was it all a lie? This thing that was supposed to be sacred, this marriage that my parents have, now it's broken. Does that mean all of these sacred commitments are broken? So, and again, this probably has to do with the fact that a lot of religious communities, most of them I'd say, have marriage as a key value. Okay. So close social influences also play a role. Okay, a couple of ways. Parents stop attending, youth stops attending, or young people start spending time with others who don't share their faith commitments, are socially pluralistic kind of contexts. And again, this happens in all sorts of scenarios. Maybe parents wanted to take their children to a religious institution and give them that kind of basis until they were old enough to choose for themselves. And then it's like, okay, I've given my kids that basis. I'm going to stop going. There's all sorts of reasons parents stop going. Divorce is a big one as well. People get divorced, move away, stop attending religious services, never find another community, or find religious communities not that inviting to divorced people. They stop attending, and then young people stop attending as well. Friends as well, and romantic partners, I would say, plays a big role. You start hanging out with people who are non-religious or differently religious, or especially you start dating someone. And again, like, this is all, if we want to put it back to my buddy Stark. I love Stark. Bite your tongue. He's my spirit animal. I have a shrine to him in my bedroom. Right? It's social bonds. Right? And again, this is really straightforward. This is the Mooney's study. Again, what do you do, right, in terms of religious beliefs or cultural beliefs? Typically, you bring your beliefs into alignment with the people who are most socially significant to you, right? So if your parents shift their beliefs, that's a significant social bond. It is actually the most significant social bond. You will shift your beliefs. But if you start spending time with friends, right, you really like these people, they have different social values, they have different kind of beliefs, you're probably going to bring your beliefs into line with them. And romantic partners is like, a huge one. Why did women in ancient Rome get their husbands to convert to Christianity, though those husbands were pagan? Because people want to bring their beliefs into alignment with the people they care most about, right? The people that they have the most significant social bonds with. So you get, you're religious and you start dating an atheist, there's a really good chance that one of you is going to move, right, in terms of those beliefs. Again, not 100%, but it gets much stronger. And I've seen this go both ways, right? But romantic partners, right, because especially initially, there's so much energy in that. You're so excited about it. That can really shift your social values in major ways. Okay, 4 minutes. Okay, life transitions. Oh boy. Changing jobs, probably not the most intense one, but obviously a job that changes your, people are looking at my slides from the hallway. Changing jobs, shifting of social patterns, right? Shifting of the way you live your life, your schedule can potentially lead to not being able to make it to religious services, cutting back on religious services, all of these sorts of things. That can lead to declines. Oh, Right, you can find all of this in a book called Souls in Transition, The Religious and Spiritual Lives of Emerging Adults by Christian Smith and Patricia Snell. Her name was cut off on the slide, but she was the co-author. Okay, moving, right? Moving is a big one because if you leave a particular area, right, you suddenly cut all of those social relationships that are key to maintaining religious identity, right? You move to a different city, you were going to, say, a mosque in Edmonton, and then you move to Toronto. A lot of those social bonds are now broken. So the things that were keeping you attending religious services are weakened, right? And so there's a moment there where until you reestablish those bonds, if you do, there's a chance to kind of step away from religion. These two kind of go together, going to university, or especially in the US, college, right? Or moving to go to university. But again, here you're going to meet a whole bunch of new people. You're going to break a whole bunch of social bonds you had before, and you're in that kind of late adolescent, emerging adult period where you're shifting your beliefs and trying to figure out who you are anyway. Right, so parental divorce, big one, I already talked about this. Your own divorce, right? If you were married and you get divorced, this can have a big effect in terms of religious belief, because again, you may have invested your own kind of marriage with religious significance, and if it falls apart, it can be a sort of scar religiously. Death of a religious family member, and inevitably this almost always is mom or grandmother, who was the person religiously that was keeping you sort of connected to religion, right? Because often it's, for whatever reason, historically, it's been mothers more likely to be that tether, or grandmothers. And that will tend to keep people in that space. And busyness, which is not really a life transition, but especially as you step into adolescence, and emerging adulthood, you're in school, you're working, those things can sort of feel like they leave no time for religion, right? And religion gets shunted to the side, and that's the slow drift away, right? It's like, yeah, I stopped going for a couple of weeks because I had exams, and then I just didn't go back, and before I knew it, it was a year that I hadn't been to, the synagogue or whatever, right? So not really a life transition, but as you enter this phase of life that's much busier and more structured, often you find that you kind of fade away from it. Okay, I'm out of time. I used every moment I could. And now we will continue on Friday. And I made it like halfway through the nuns. We might finish on Friday. Maybe not. I got 20 slides. We'll do our best. All righty.
Hi.
Hello.
So the same principles for the becoming a nun. Is that the same principles for religious living?
In a lot of cases, yeah. I mean, it will tend to follow, I think, very similar lines, right?